I want to thank you for coming tonight. My name is Michael Bishea, and I am the director of the Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication, and we welcome you to the annual Chamberlain Lecture, sponsored by the Chamberlain Lecture Fund, the Leo Morris chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, the Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication, the Iowa Newspaper Foundation, the great Iowa State Daily, and the Committee on Lectures, which is funded by the government of the student body. The Chamberlain Lecture is the Greenlee School's showcase fall semester event. Thanks to the generosity of our benefactors, Margaret and Jean Chamberlain, their Iowa State alumni. Jean passed away earlier this year. He was my friend and newspaper publisher with Margie at the Mobridge Tribune in South Dakota. I met them both at South Dakota State University, my alma mater, in the 1970s, and Gene was looking forward to this event because he admired the zeal and reporting of tonight's featured speaker, author and magazine journalist, Bethany McLean. She will be introduced momentarily by another friend and colleague, Alan Morris, who with his brother Steve carry on the tradition of excellent community journalism as co-publishers of the Harlan Tribune. Jennifer Asa, director of the Iowa Newspaper Foundation, will tell you more about Alan, chosen as this year's 2009 Chamberlain Fellow. Jennifer?
Thank you, Michael. The Iowa Newspaper Foundation is proud to partner with Iowa State University on this important event this evening. The 2009 Chamberlain Fellow, Alan Morris, returned to newspapering after leaving the Washington, D.C. staff of Louisiana Congressman Henson Moore and a career in politics behind to join the family business, the Harlan Newspapers. The 25-employee firm, owned by the family since 1939, had owned a variety of Iowa community papers, but through the leadership of his father, they sold the newspapers back to their managers to ensure local ownership. Today, they own Iowa's fourth largest twice-weekly newspaper, 2 shoppers, and a central printing plant, which prints 30 area newspaper and niche publications. To date, their newspapers have been awarded over 260 state and national awards. In 1996, Morris created the company's ad agency, Media Management, and he continues to oversee their web offset printing, internet services, cable news, 18 News, and printing and graphic divisions. An Iowa State graduate, he serves on the executive board of the Iowa Association of Business and Industry, is chair of the quarterly magazine Iowa Biz, and recently left the Greenlee School of Journalism's Advisory Council after 12 years of service. Morris was named the youngest president of the Iowa Newspaper Association and Iowa Newspaper Foundation, and was the youngest recipient of the association's Master Editor Publisher Award. He was also named Iowa Journalist of the Year by the Small Business Administration, along with his brother, co-owner Steve Morris. He and his brother honored their late father by helping fund Iowa State's newly named Leo Morris chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, and in partnership with the Iowa Newspaper Foundation, established the Leo Morris Leadership Institute for up-and-coming newspaper publishers. It is my honor to welcome Alan Morris.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's my privilege tonight to be here and be this year's Chamberlain Fellow. It's an honor that I never anticipated, and I thank the Chamberlain family. It's been a great experience and a great idea and concept that you came up with. It's been a rewarding experience for me personally. Tonight, it's my privilege to introduce Bethany McLean. Bethany is an extraordinary young journalist who's written a number of important financial industry articles. Bethany grew up in Hibbing, Minnesota, and shares that distinction with one of America's most famous singer-songwriters, Bob Dylan. Bethany is currently a contributing editor to Vanity Fair magazine and is best known for her work uncovering the Enron scandal. She asked 2 very important and simple questions. how does Enron make money, and is Enron overpriced? She asked that question at a time when Fortune magazine had recently named Enron America's most innovative company. McLean and her former Fortune colleague Peter Elkin later wrote The Smartest Guys in the Room, which exposed the corrupt business practices of Enron. The book was a result of her reporting on Enron, and it later became part of an Academy Award-nominated documentary. Her column, The Bulldog, appeared regularly in Fortune, and she had joined Vanity Fair in 2008. She earned her bachelor's degree in English and mathematics at Williams College in 1992. After she graduated from college, she joined Goldman Sachs as an investment banker. She's made appearances on the NewsHour with Jim Lear, The Colbert Report, The Daily Show, as well as the PBS program Now. She is now writing a book on the financial crisis of 2008 and has a wonderful new addition to her family, a 15-year-old daughter. Congratulations. Okay. Welcome, Bethany McLean.
Thanks, everyone, for coming out. So I thought I'd start by telling you the story of how I came to write about Enron, because it became such a seminal moment in my career, although it really didn't start out that way. And it traces in some ways the growth of what I like to think of as skepticism rather than cynicism, and I think there's an important difference between those two concepts. When I started looking into Enron, this was the fall of 1999, and Enron was what I think of as an it stock. Just like Hollywood has it girls, Wall Street has it stocks, these companies that can do no wrong. Enron stock had gone up 50% in 1999. It had gone up over 80% in 2000. Almost every investment analyst who covered the stock was telling investors to buy. Blue chip consultants from the most blue chip consulting firm of all, McKinsey, ran around the globe preaching to clients how they could make their businesses more like Enron's. Petropreneurs is what they called the people at Enron, when a word that only a consultant could devise. In late 1999, I'd been at Fortune for about 4 years. I had a pretty untraditional background for a journalist. I had gone to Williams and majored in math and English, and figured out during my last years at Williams that I was not suited to go on and get my PhD in math, and hit my senior year thinking, what on earth am I going to do? So I was sitting in our Office of Career Counseling, and I couldn't get my cover letter to print out on one page, and I got very frustrated, so I decided I was just going to put my resume in all the slots at the Career Counseling office that didn't require a cover letter. And lo and behold, those were all the investment banks, and since I was a female math major, the investment banks wanted to hire me, and I ended up working on Wall Street with really no clue what investment banking was. In fact, I'm not even sure I knew what a stock was at that time. It was an interesting transition. I'd grown up in a mining town in northern Minnesota. My mom, when I started working at Goldman Sachs, used to clip articles out of the newspaper about mergers and acquisitions and mail them to me. But I learned a few things during my time on Wall Street that I've actually come to view as pretty critical to the practice of journalism. The first thing I learned during my years on Wall Street was how not to be intimidated. And I think coming out of college, I still had a hard time picking up the phone to call someone. I had a hard time asking people unpleasant questions. And I got over that pretty quickly during my years on Wall Street. Another skill that I think was important is knowing how to start when you don't know how to start. A lot of the tasks that you had to do as a young investment banker would be complicated analysis of a company. You'd have no clue how to begin. You probably hadn't slept the night before. There'd be nobody around to show you how to get started, and you just have to figure it out. And to me, that's essential to being a journalist, because a lot of stories that you get started on, you think at first, how on earth am I going to do this? How am I going to start? And you have to figure out a way just to get started, even when you don't know what the first thing to do is. I think the third skill I learned that is really critical to anything you do later in life is how to be meticulous about the little details. I remember running into real trouble during my early years in investment banking because I'd make mistakes on things that I considered silly. So I'd put a 30% compound annual growth rate on a line that was going flat and a 5% growth rate on a line that was going straight up in the air. So who cares? Everybody knew what I meant. And you learn very quickly that it's getting the little things right that matter. And that's a critical thing for a journalist, and it's a critical thing for anything in life. So I ended up at Fortune when I decided that I'd always wanted to be a journalist and never really had the guts to pursue it. But I left Goldman Sachs and deferred business school for a year and went to Fortune as a fact checker. And I found myself in a little bit of a pickle when I first got to Fortune because I really didn't know how to write. If I had ever had a clue how to write, 3 years of working in investment banking and doing presentations with one line words had pretty much done me in. And I'm still convinced, and we can come back to this later for the journalists in the crowd, but that the only way you learn to write is by writing. Whatever kind of natural talent you have, there's nothing like just writing day in and day out to make you a better writer. But it was hard for me to get started at Fortune because I didn't have a traditional background and I didn't have a lot of writing skills, in perfect honesty. So the only way I could really get started at the magazine was to do the work that other people didn't want to do. And at that time, personal finance coverage, writing about stocks and bonds, was kind of a backwater of the magazine. This was the 1990s. Technology stocks were going gangbusters. Everybody wanted to write sexy stories about people who made millions overnight, and nobody wanted to really dig into a company's financial statements. And I did, because that was the only way I could find stories that would get published. I did a column called Companies to Watch, which was a column about hot up-and-coming companies. And it was actually a great training ground because I'd get pitched all the time by PR people who wanted me to write about the companies they represented, or stock analysts who had buy ratings on certain companies, or mutual fund managers who owned a stock and wanted to see it written about, so hopefully more people would buy it and the stock went higher. And I pretty quickly learned that the sexier the story and the higher a price target an analyst had on it and the more enthusiastic these people were, the more sure I could be that it was going to go straight down after I wrote about it. And so I developed a pretty healthy skepticism about people telling me that something was great, only to find out later that it actually wasn't that great. And I began to develop another set of sources, people who were sort of unpopular during this long bull market because they wanted to see, they were short sellers, meaning they were betting that a stock would go down in value. And they kept to themselves. These were hard people to get to talk to you because in the business community, no one has any incentive to say anything negative about anybody. So you had to really work to develop relationships with these people where they'd trust you. And most of the time they wouldn't be on the record, meaning they might give you a tip and say, why don't you take a look at this? But you would have to go off and do all of the homework on your own. And it's interesting because people have often said to me after the fact, well, how could you possibly take a tip from somebody who's betting that a stock is going to go down? They're biased. And my response to that is, what do you think company management is? What do you think analysts who have a buy rating on a stock are? Do you think they're not biased? Many times in journalism, many of your sources, if not all of them, are biased in some way or another. And the trick is to find bias on both sides of the equation, do your own homework, and figure out where you think the truth lies. It's an interesting thing about this crisis we've had today because there's kind of a shoot the messenger attitude out there about the financial crisis where instead of saying that short sellers spotted the problems in the market as many of them did, instead people are saying short sellers are to blame. And if they weren't in existence, then stocks never would have gone down as much as they did. And the Securities and Exchange Commission has even moved to ban short selling, despite the fact that there's in place tighter restrictions on it, despite the fact that there's very little evidence that this practice contributed to the problems. And in fact, many short sellers were saying about the big investment banks before they went under their problems here. So back to Enron, a guy named Jim Chanos, who's a well-known short seller, called me up and said I should take a closer look at Enron's financial statements. And Jim was very amused because Fortune magazine, where I worked at the time, had named Enron its most admired company for the past 6 years running, and the most innovative company. And I like to joke that Enron actually was the most innovative company in corporate America. It's just that none of us knew exactly how innovative they were. So for those of you who are finance geeks in the audience, I dug out all Enron's financial statements. I went through the documents, and there were all sorts of weird things in there. While Enron was producing plenty of earnings per share, its cash flow from operations was actually negative. And reported earnings per share is kind of a paper profit. In order to run a business, you need to be generating cash. So it was very odd that there was this huge divergence between these two parts of the financial statements. It was very difficult to tell how Enron actually made its money. When I began to call around and ask questions, people would say things like, I remember talking to the credit rating agencies which are supposed to gauge how sound Enron's bonds were, and one of them, I said, well, how does Enron make its money? And the analyst on the other end of the phone said, when you figure it out, let me know. And then there was this really odd thing in Enron's financial statements. The chief financial officer, a guy named Andy Fastow, ran these outside partnerships that did all their business with Enron itself. And that's really odd to see the chief financial officer of a company running an outside company that only does business with the parent company. And you couldn't make heads or tails of what kind of business this was. The disclosures were written in a way that made it impossible to tell what was actually taking place. So I began to work on my story and to make calls. And of course, I had to call Enron to ask them about some of the things I was finding. And they got Jeff Skilling, who was then the company's chief executive officer, on the phone. And he basically had a temper tantrum. He said anybody who raised the kind of questions I was raising was just throwing rocks at the company. And then he accused me of being unethical because he said, if you had done enough homework, you would realize how stupid your questions are. And it's not ethical of you to want to publish this piece when you clearly don't understand what you're talking about. And that's actually a terrifying thing for a journalist to be accused of, because the truth is that could be right. You could always be missing something. No matter how much work you've done, you could always just be overlooking the obvious and being incredibly unfair to your subject. And so it's a very scary thing to be told. The next day, the chief financial officer, Andy Fastow, the company's head of investor relations, and another guy flew up to New York to meet with me. I still remember actually how sick to my stomach I was before this meeting. And I asked all the questions I had to ask, and I'll never forget this. At the end of the meeting, Andy Fastow turned to my editors and me, and he said, I don't care what you say about the company, just don't make me look bad. We all actually thought he was joking, but as it turns out, that wasn't true. And and you know, it's interesting because my editors after this meeting said they didn't answer a single question you had, make the story tougher. And I give my editors a lot of kudos for that, as I do for subsequent events. It turns out that Ken Lay, the chairman of the company, actually called my magazine trying to get them not to run the story. And I didn't actually even hear about that phone call had taken place until after Enron's bankruptcy. My editor did what any good editor should and shielded me from that kind of pressure. So the story ran under what was actually a pretty meek headline called "Is Enron Overpriced?" It was going to be "Is Enron a hedge fund in drag?" but I lost my nerve at the last minute. After the story ran, frankly, there wasn't that much of a reaction. It kind of came out with a dull thud. And in that, I think, is a pretty instructive lesson, which is that you can't pursue stories just because you think they're going to be good, big stories. You have to write about things because you're interested in them. I wrote about Enron not because I thought it was going to become the corporate scandal of the decade, but because I was interested. Here was something that just didn't add up. It didn't make sense. I didn't write it expecting the story to make a splash. I wasn't disappointed when it didn't. I thought, well, you know, I've aired this thing that I'm interested in. I'm lucky enough that I didn't make any mistakes. I haven't gotten sued. I put my head down and went off to write a story about soy milk. But I really think that there's a real lesson in there for journalists, which is that you have to follow your own creativity and your own curiosity. And if you're not really interested in the things you're writing about, then you shouldn't be a journalist, because there aren't enough rewards in it other than the fantastic reward of being able to pursue your own curiosity. And if you're not deeply curious, you're frankly not going to be very good at it, because the only way you make the number of phone calls you should and sit on the internet late at night tracking down documents and going through hundreds of pages of financial statements trying to find something is because you're really curious and you want the answer. And you won't do that. There's just no way you'll be able to make yourself do that if you don't really care. So it's interesting. In the story I wrote, I obviously was very skeptical of the analysts who had buy ratings on Enron stock. I'd learned that from my previous work. But I actually didn't write about Andy Fastow's weird partnerships in this story. I didn't include them. And the reason was because Enron's accountants and its board of directors had signed off on these partnerships. And I thought, the accountants and the board of directors have signed off on them. I guess I must be crazy to think there's something wrong here. And obviously, I've since become a little more skeptical of things. What happened next is that the next summer in 2001, Jeff Skilling abruptly quit as the CEO of Enron. Ken Lay stepped back into to take over the company, tried to reassure investors that everything was okay, but people began to ask the tough questions that they should have been asking all along, and Enron spiraled into bankruptcy. And on December 1st at 2 o'clock in the morning, December 1st, 2001 at 2 o'clock in the morning, Enron declared what was briefly the largest bankruptcy in corporate history. It was quickly supplanted by WorldCom and now by Lehman Brothers. But despite the fact that Enron isn't the biggest, it's really lodged in the cultural consciousness in a very interesting way. It was on the front page of the New York Times for day after day after day after the bankruptcy, and it still marks a moment in business history, and I think in more than business history. And I'm not sure why that is. We were talking about it earlier, but I think it's partly because these images that were splashed across newspapers and across TV of people who thought that they were secure financially, secure in their savings, secure in their jobs, walking out of the Enron building with boxes full of their belongings, no severance, worthless 401k. I think that made everybody panicked that maybe the security of working for a big company isn't what you think it is, and that even the biggest companies in America may be shockingly hollow at their core. So there's a funny story here, actually. When the Enron team declared bankruptcy, they flew up from Houston on the company's G5 corporate jet, and they stayed at the Four Seasons. A guy I talked to later joked to me that they should have flown up on Southwest Airlines and stayed at the Ramada Inn. I had not really planned to write a book at this time in my career, but when you find yourself in the middle of a big story, books happen, and so I found myself with a book to do, much to my surprise. And in the course of doing this book and in thinking about Enron, I learned a lot of lessons that I think are applicable to both life and journalism. I think the first story for me was that all business stories are stories about people. And that may seem obvious to some of you in this room, but for a math major turned investment banker, it seemed like a revelation to me. And it remains to me why business journalism is just so fantastically interesting. They're always stories about people. Ken Lay, Jeff Skilling, and the others at Enron were self-made men. Ken Lay grew up with no indoor plumbing until he was 11 years old. He became one of the most successful men in corporate America, only to plummet from the heights into a criminal conviction. Jeff Skilling, too, people who met him described him as incandescently brilliant. He had a tough childhood and went on to become a consultant at McKinsey, signed his contract to go work at Enron when his wife was giving birth to their first child, and he transformed Enron from this sleepy natural gas pipeline into this sexy, high-growth, testosterone-driven trading company. And in the end, the Enron story is a story about a collision of personalities at a unique time in the late 1990s where big stories, which Enron had, sold. And it was at a particular place as well, Houston, Texas, where everything is always outsized. And that's always true of business. There are always stories about fascinating characters. I say over and over again when I write business stories that truth is stranger than fiction. And time and again, that's proven true. My first story for Vanity Fair last fall was about a guy named Henry Nicholas, another self-made guy who created a technology company called Broadcom that was one of the big success stories of the late 1990s, early 2000s. And Nicholas, fantastically brilliant engineer, ended up being indicted last spring on charges of stock options backdating, which is kind of a technical financial thing, and drug trafficking. And the drug trafficking indictment contained these amazing allegations that he had built a lair under his house that was a secret from his wife where he could do drugs and have prostitutes. And anyway, so I went on to write a story about this guy. And the last line of my story I quoted from Calvin and Hobbes, and it's, "Calvin, do you believe in the devil? You know, a supreme evil being dedicated to the temptation, corruption, and destruction of man? Hobbes, I'm not sure man needs the help." I learned in the process of investigating this story to a great secret for sneaking into gated communities, which is to hire a limousine. Anyway, but onward with the strange stories. I mean, who could make up the story of Bernie Madoff, right? Right down to his last name, Madoff. I mean, how perfect is that? I guess the second thing I learned was a big lesson to me is that stories aren't black and white, and that's a tricky one because there is right and wrong. And I'd argue that being a human being and being a magazine writer means making a call on right and wrong. But it's often not black and white. And what I mean by that is I always thought when I headed into writing my book on Enron, that the people at Enron all knew that they were working for a bad company, and that when I was finally able to get somebody to talk to me, I'd be able to call up and say, so how'd you do it? How'd you orchestrate the fraud in your division? How'd you make up the numbers? And that's just absolutely not how it happened. I would say very few people who work there had a clue that anything was wrong. And there are a few reasons for that. One is that people in big corporations are worker bees. You've got your head down, you're doing your job. You don't look outside your own narrow slice of the world and see how things fit together or don't fit together until it's all imploded around you. I think another part of it is that people were blinded by the money. There was just so much money at Enron. I talked to a guy who was a very sophisticated guy. He'd been a banker for 15 years before he went to work at Enron in the last year of the company's life. And he worked in 3 different businesses. And at each business, he said, this doesn't make any sense. This business isn't it's spending cash in order to book paper profits. This doesn't work. But he'd come back to the company's offices in London, which overlooked Buckingham Palace, and he'd shrug his shoulders and say, well, the money's got to be coming from somewhere. I think that's true, broadly speaking, in business, that people get blinded by the money and they begin to think that everything they do is justified, and even more sort of dangerously, they begin to think that they're worth the money. And I think about that on a recent piece I did for Vanity Fair on the hedge fund business, which isn't necessarily a fraud. But these people made so much money that they began to believe that they were worth the amounts of money they made. In the top years of the hedge fund business, people were taking home literally $1 billion and more. A hedge fund structure is that you get paid 2% of any assets under you manage, and then 20% of any gains that you can produce. And over the last decade, this business that had been a business for really gutsy entrepreneurs who wanted to operate outside the system and not go work for big schools became a business where every Harvard Business School graduate felt entitled to his billions of dollars. One Wall Streeter described the fee structure to me this way. He said, I make a lot, you pay me. If I lose a lot, I don't give anything back. So he gave me this math, which I thought was interesting. He said, assume you give a hedge fund manager $100 million and he doubles it. The manager gets $20 million of that. The next year, he's down 50%. Your $100 million is now $90 million, but the manager's got his $20 million. It's kind of a strange business, right? Another guy I know in the hedge fund business told me this story about a really successful hedge fund manager who'd had a bad year, and he said, he was talking and said, you know what, maybe I'm not so great. Maybe I'm not really so smart. Maybe we were all just operating at a unique time in the markets where markets only seem to go up, and maybe we just got lucky. I thought that was amazingly introspective for one of these guys. For people who could have seen that there was something wrong at Enron, I also think there's always a certain amount of delusion in white-collar fraud. Not I'll get away with it delusion, but rather I'll make it right in the end. If I can just pull it off for this quarter, this reporting period, even if that requires a few lies, a few little white lies, I'll fix it the next quarter when business gets better. And people make decisions, small little incremental decisions. They go from A to B to C to D. And suddenly they're at Z, and Z is a long way from A, and Z is clearly black where A was white. And they never made a decision to go from white to black. They just slid through the shades of gray until they got there. And the problem, of course, is that if you make those little lies, if you deprive investors of the right to know everything that you know about operating a company, you may end up a convict. And that in many ways is what happened to Ken Lay. He never intended to bankrupt his company. He loved his company. He wanted to save it. But he stepped back in after Jeff Skilling had quit and lied to investors in an effort to save his company, and ended up convicted of criminal fraud. I think this applies to Jeff Skilling, too. When he says he's innocent, and he still claims he is innocent today, his case is actually being appealed now, I think he believes it. He once said, I am Enron. He identified so much with this company he created that he literally couldn't accept the fact that it was a failure, because to do so, I think, would have meant accepting that he was a failure. The only case I know of in white-collar fraud where self-delusion or wishful thinking just isn't part of the problem is Bernie Madoff. That story is still unraveling, but I don't think there's any way that he thought he was going to make it right the next quarter. But what makes all of this interesting to me is that there's a fine line between the super successful CEO and the criminal. And that may sound like a really odd thing to say, but to be super successful in building a company, maybe not in running a successful one, but in building one from scratch, you often have to be a crazy optimist, somebody who believes that you can make it okay in the end. And when does that cross the line into lying to people? Usually, frankly, after things have gone spectacularly wrong. But if you manage to pull it off in the end, I think there are a lot of cases where people have probably gotten away with it. The last lesson from me is that financial crimes rarely have perfectly clear-cut villains and heroes. I think every financial crime requires, in some ways, the complicity of the victims, usually in the sense that they're willing to believe something that's too good to be true. That's certainly true of the Bernie Madoff scandal. It's also true of Enron. I wasn't a financial sleuth of any kind. I'm not a certified public accountant. Investors could have done their homework and seen the same warning signs I did and asked the same questions I did. They didn't. Why? Because they wanted Enron stock to keep going higher. No one was incented to ask the tough questions. I think the Enron affair also took the complicity of the system, certainly the Enron's accountants. I never would have guessed they would have signed off on all the policies that they permitted at Enron, all the ways in which Enron basically used the accounting rules in order to manufacture fake profits. And Enron became a very difficult case to try criminally because so much of what they did was following the letter of the law while totally violating the spirit of the law, following the letter of the rules, making it very difficult to prosecute them, yet committing mind-blowing ethical wrongdoing. The accountants knew very early on that Enron's practices were problematic. In fact, an Arthur Anderson accountant put together a song in 1991 about Enron's practices. It's called the Hotel Kenneth Leah, and it goes to the tune of the Hotel California. If I could sing, I'd sing it to you, but since I can't, I'm just going to read it. It goes, "Welcome to the Hotel Mark to Market, such a lovely face, such a fragile place. They livin' it up at the hotel, cram it down ya. When the suits arrive, bring your alibis." A former Enron employee described Enron's accounting to me this way. He said, say you have a dog and you want to make it into a duck. You give it a yellow beak, white fur, webbed feet, and you say to your accountants, look, I've met all the rules for calling this a duck. Clearly it's a duck. And the accountants say, okay, it's a duck. All you have to do is look at it and see that it's a dog. But everybody goes along with the fiction that it's a duck. Enron's board, they weren't complicit in what happened, but they surely failed in protecting investors. The credit rating agencies, the guy I mentioned that I talked to who laughed and said, let me know when you figure it out, they rated Enron investment grade, meaning that its bonds were safe for widows and orphans to hold until just a few days before it collapsed into bankruptcy. The bankers who funded Enron, if big banks like J.P. Morgan Chase and Citigroup hadn't been willing to give Enron billions of dollars in cash, actually $8 billion in cash over Enron's lifetime, Enron never would have been able to keep going. They wouldn't have been able to pull it off because they needed Wall Street's willingness to fund them in order to get away with it. Which in a way brings us to where we are today. We desperately want to find bad guys for what happened over the past couple of years. We want to find the villains who destroyed our entire economy. But you actually can't do that because it took the complicity of the entire system. It took homeowners, some of whom were tricked, yes, but many of whom took out mortgages that they couldn't afford. It took the rating agencies once again who assigned AAA ratings, and a AAA means that this thing is rock solid. It's never going to lose money. Assigned AAA ratings to bonds that had been created out of these very mortgages made to people who couldn't pay them back. And you had the investment banks who packaged up these securities and sold them off to investors who bought these securities without understanding what they were buying because they produced profits, and it seemed all good at the time. Do you hear another common theme here? One of the really depressing things to me about what happened over the last couple of years is that some of the bad actors remain the same. The rating agencies, the investment banks. It's the same players all over again. To me, in many ways, Enron was the canary in the coal mine. It happened a long time ago, but it's still hugely relevant, not just because it holds this place in our cultural consciousness of a marker of times that are past, but because it's so relevant for what just went wrong. It showed people, or it should have showed people, that you can't trust the institutions that are supposed to serve as gatekeepers. That Wall Street, in its lust for money, will operate in its own short-term best interest, but often not in its own long-term best interest. Look at all the losses that the Wall Street banks are taking now, some of whom have been wiped out from this. And of course, so soon after Enron, investors forgot the cardinal rules. If it seems too good to be true, maybe it is. If you don't understand something, don't buy it. And now, in the aftermath of this financial calamity, you have the same dodging of responsibility that happened in the aftermath of Enron. Because everybody is to blame, it almost appears as if no one is to blame. The last chapter of our Enron book, the epilogue, we entitled it, Isn't Anybody Sorry? And I think to engage in this dodging of responsibility, it requires this notion that ethical behavior requires nothing more than avoiding the explicitly illegal, that refusing to see bad things happening in front of you makes you innocent, and that telling the truth is the same thing as making sure that no one can prove that you lied. So I think that it's a frightening time, and what's frightening to me, and what makes all this very poignant to me, is that the terrible economy has accelerated some of the problems and challenges that print media is facing now. It was already a business model that was under siege. Print publications never recovered from the brief recession of the early part of this decade, and have been struggling to find a business model that will work in this new digital world. And the crash in the economy has just accelerated the collapse, but unfortunately it hasn't accelerated the solution. I know many talented journalists today who are struggling to find work. Many of you in the audience might disagree with me. I'm a huge defender of traditional media for two reasons that I think that to me pose a challenge to this new world we're entering into. One is that there are standards in traditional media. Traditional journalists, the mainstream media, we don't always get it right. But there is recourse to people if you get it wrong, and there are rules, like me having to call Enron before I wrote a story about them, like giving somebody a chance to comment before you castigate them in print. I don't know about any of you, but those calls are the toughest calls for me to make, where you have to confront somebody with unpleasant questions. But you have to do that. It's part of your responsibility. And too much of what goes on the web strikes me as just bullying. The second thing to me that I think is great about traditional media is that it's a push model instead of a pull model. I worry too much in the digital world that you have to pull information towards you that you're interested in, which means you're going to read things that you're already interested in, and you're going to read viewpoints that you already believe in, instead of broadening your world by reading something that you're not already interested in, or reading something that you wildly disagree with because it's printed in a publication that you respect, and that forces you to challenge your own thinking. And that's what the best journalism is. I was thinking about this recently because I read a story in the New York Times over the summer that I never would have read if I had been on the internet. I was just flipping through the paper, and it was a story about fireflies. It was entitled "Seduction and Deceit in a Firefly's Flashes," and it began, "Dr. Sarah Lewis is fluent in firefly," and it went on to describe a meadow where she did her work observing the mating patterns of fireflies. And it ended, "For Dr. Lewis, this meadow is the stage for an invertebrate melodrama full of passion and yearning, of courtship duets and competitions for affection, of cruel deception and gruesome death." I loved this piece. So my big question about the future for journalism, and then the thing I worry a great deal about, is there a business model for journalism? Is journalism ever a business, and was it a business? And I think about a few things in that respect. I'm not sure, in the normal rules of a business, if you produce a better product, people pay more for it. And if it's a product people want, they're willing to pay for it. I'm not really sure that journalism follows those rules. The important stories people write about what's happening in Baghdad, about the nuances of the healthcare debate, are nowhere near as widely read as pictures of Britney Spears. Does that mean that those stories are somehow less valuable? In a classic business model, that would be the case. Less demand, they're not as good. And I worry that good journalism people never really paid for good journalism. It was subsidized by classified advertising, by a whole host of other things that newspapers had that we don't have now. And I'm not sure how to find a business model that works. And I really do deeply believe that without good journalism, I'm not sure what we are as a society. But I do have a piece of encouragement for all of you aspiring journalists in finding your way, which is that there's never been a career path in journalism. Medical school, you go to medical school for 4 years, you become a resident, then you maybe go on to do a fellowship, you become a doctor. Investment banking, you get a job as an analyst, you become an associate, you become a vice president, you become a partner if you're lucky. There's a track. There's really never been a track in journalism. It's actually the purest meritocracy that I can think of, because sort of in a twist on your mother's old saying, you are what you eat, you are what you write. And it doesn't matter where you went to school or what sort of training you had beforehand. If you produce good work, at least historically, there's always been a place for it. And that's kind of scary because there isn't a clear-cut path, and luck plays a role in what happens. But it's also pretty great because there isn't a clear-cut path, which means you get to make it up for yourself. So on that note, I'd like to open it up to any questions you all might have.
Two of those? Do you have two of those?
No.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, because we have so many people here tonight, I'm going to ask Pat Miller to be our Vanna White. And she's going to, if you have a question, stand and she'll approach you with the microphone. I'll try to repeat the question and let Bethany answer it. So we don't have a lot of time, but we will move ahead as best we can. We have a first question right over there.
If you repeat the question, I don't have to run around.
No, you have to run around.
Okay.
You can yell.
So, is some of the legislation that was passed in the wake of Enron, such as Sarbanes-Oxley, has that been helpful in avoiding things like this, or was the legislation kind of knee-jerk and missed the mark?
I think, did everybody hear the question? Okay. I'm a little bit skeptical about the power of regulation to fix the problem, and I am because of my experience looking at Enron, where the company was such an expert at obeying the letter of the law and totally violating the spirit of the law, and more laws would almost have provided a roadmap of the possible for them. If you are determined to get around the laws and find the space between the laws in which to operate, no legislation is going to stop you. And Sarbanes-Oxley did do a few things, I think, by forcing executives of companies to sign off on the company's financial statements. Short sellers in the market tell me there's less fraud out there, less absolute fraud out there than there once was. But did Sarbanes-Oxley have absolutely any relevance to the current economic calamity? None whatsoever. And that's the problem with regulators. They're often sort of waging a Maginot Line kind of defense. They're putting up the fortress over here, and the enemy is going around the back and they're always fighting the last battle in some respect. And so I worry about that today with the rush to new regulations. And I also think a lot of what happened over the past 5 years was not a lack of regulations. It was a failure to use the existing regulations. And if regulators don't have the will to regulate, no amount of regulations in the world are going to make a difference.
Have to stand up. Oh yeah. Question about violence in your industry. Obviously, a lot of the Russian journalists have been killed and threatened. Have you ever had that kind of experience here in the United States?
You know, the only threats I've ever gotten have been probably from harmless people who are drunk late at night on their computer. And whenever I'd write that people should be careful of the housing market, I got lots of those that pretty much approached death threats, but I didn't actually take them all that seriously. I think the form of intimidation, the form of threats that happen in the business journalism world in a place like the United States are far more the intellectual intimidation, the don't you realize how stupid you are and how stupid you're going to look if you say this. It's that form of bullying rather than physical intimidation.
Yeah, I have a question on how you developed those relationships with the sources that you found on Enron.
Yeah, I think it's just a slow process, and one that involves treating people right. And I cover a lot of different material today, and one of the things about being a magazine writer is that you're always starting from scratch with every story. You have to figure out who you're going to talk to and make a whole new set of sources. But I have kept with me over the past 10 or 15 years in journalism a core set of people who I can call up and bounce things off and say, does this sound crazy to you? Does this make sense to you? Does this work? And it takes persistence, and it takes being educated when you talk to people so that you can ask them good questions. And it takes doing the right thing with the materials they give you, or they tip you off to, which doesn't necessarily mean agreeing with them, because they may point you in directions that you say, I don't think there's anything here. But it means doing the homework and not using things loosely. And what I know is a touchy subject for journalists today, but that if you promise someone confidentiality, you adhere to that to the death. And I think if you do that over time, you get a reputation of being someone who's trustworthy, and if you do your homework, I think you also get a reputation of being somebody who's fair, and then people are more willing to continue to talk to you.
Okay, besides a lack of will to regulate, was there also not a decline in the budgets that regulatory agencies were receiving over the last 5 years or so?
I believe there was. Well, one of the challenges has been that many of our major regulatory agencies, the Office of Thrift Supervision, for example, which regulated Washington Mutual and Countrywide, as well as AIG, all of which are, broadly speaking, failed institutions. The OTS funds itself by taxes on the companies that it regulates. So, in other words, it is paid by the companies that it regulates. So its incentive is to get more companies to regulate so that it can make more money and hire more people. I mean, it's a government agency, but to have more funds. And if you're trying to encourage people to be regulated by you, well, that sets up sort of a bad precedent, don't you think? I believe the SEC, too, I'm not positive of the answer to your question. I believe the SEC has faced a great deal of budgetary problems as well. And there was definitely a deregulatory ethos over the past 8 years or so that believed that the free market could solve all problems.
Okay, here. Oh, second.
The question was, what was her motivation to transfer to Vanity Fair from Fortune?
You know, it was a hard decision for me because I grew up at Fortune and it was my family in many ways, but it was the only place I'd ever worked as a journalist, and Vanity Fair had been recruiting me for a couple of years, and in the world of journalism, the kind of top magazines are Vanity Fair and The New Yorker, and Vanity Fair is one of the few places where you can still do 9,000, 10,000 word articles and they'll run them. And I wanted to give something else a try. You know, if you grow up at one place, you're often still labeled the way you were when you came in. So at Fortune, everybody thought I was smart and a great reporter, but I carried with me this, well, she can't really write. Because I came, and it didn't matter how much I'd done over the time I'd been there. I still care, and I kind of believed it. And so when Vanity Fair wanted to hire me, I thought this is going to be a disaster. I'm going to get there, and they're going to say, "Oh my God, she can't write." But I thought, I have to try this because what's the worst thing that happens? You fall flat on your face, and you pick yourself up, and you learn something from it, and hopefully you go on from there. So I tried it, and I was shocked when I turned in my first story, and it ran basically unedited. I thought, oh. I guess maybe this thing that I'd always believed isn't actually true anymore. I have learned to write, which isn't to say I can't always learn more, but I had learned, and so it turned out it worked out well. It doesn't mean that it's the right place for me over time. I think I am a hardcore business journalist. I like writing about sort of in-depth and nuanced business subjects, and it's a little tougher to do that all the time at a place like Vanity Fair.
Especially with the touchy nature of the Enron subject and the people that you were working with writing that, having, we know now, a lot to hide, how did you manage the factors between doing the hard research and uncovering the fact and also building those relationships with the people that have something to gain from talking to you but have a lot to lose if the information becomes public?
Yeah, I didn't face that problem on my first story because my first story was really an outside-in piece. I wasn't trying to crack the company and talk to insiders. I was actually trying to say from the outside why this didn't make any sense. It was a much harder process on the book where I was trying to do that. It was made easier by the fact that Enron was already bankrupt. We knew how the story ended, so people didn't have as much to lose as they do if they're a whistleblower speaking out from a still functioning company. And that doesn't negate the other part of your question, which is how do you tell when someone wants to spin their version of the truth, when what you're hearing. And my view has always been you get something from anybody. So if you talk to a senior executive of Enron, he may have a very specific story to tell, which you may not end up agreeing with, but he still has a story to tell. And learning how that person thinks and what they want you to believe is actually a really interesting part of the journalistic process. It doesn't have to, in the end, be what you believe, but just knowing what they want you to believe tells you a lot. But I always, when people do have a lot to lose by speaking to a reporter, and I just think you have to keep that in mind and treat them with respect and treat them as a human being who has a lot to lose, and always remember that it's the person first and the story second.
I have a follow-up on the confidentiality question. I would like to know where you draw the line in granting confidentiality to a source and how you make that decision.
I am pretty liberal about granting confidentiality, and that's a somewhat controversial policy today, but there are a couple reasons why I am. One is because you can't function as a business journalist if you're not willing to grant confidentiality. Most people who work at companies are forbidden from talking to the press unless they get the approval of their PR department. Once they've gotten the approval of their PR department, you're getting the company message. You're not getting what that person thinks. So if you're going to get anybody unauthorized at a company to talk to you, you have to grant them confidentiality or they're going to lose their job. It's as simple as that. A lot of sophisticated financial people who work at hedge funds, who may do great work uncovering things about companies that you want to know, there's no incentive for them to talk to the press. They don't want to be quoted. And if you're going to get access to them and hear their ideas and hear their thoughts, it's a plain and simple trade-off. Either you grant them confidentiality or you don't get access. I've always believed, even if I can't print something, I'd rather know and not be able to print it than not know. And that, though, is a luxury I have as a magazine writer, because in magazine writing, you have more time. It's about crafting a story. It's not putting something out there on deadline. So I accept that it's a luxury I have. I don't feel that there's as much potential for abuse in business journalism as there is elsewhere, because most things that people tell you, you can verify on your own. If Jim Chanos tells me about Enron to go look at the company's financial statements, I can go look at the company's financial statements. I can do that work on my own and come to my own conclusions. All I need is somebody to tell me, go look at this. If somebody gives me a document and they don't want it to be known that they gave me the document, I've got the document. Documents can tell a story in and of themselves, and I don't need to divulge the person's name who gave me the document. So I tend to be pretty liberal about it, but I accept that, one, that's a luxury of magazine journalism, and two, it's controversial. You could definitely argue the other side of it. More questions?
Oh,
I'm sorry. I apologize. Yes.
Here.
Reading your book, it seemed like a really complicated mess to sort out. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the process of untangling all of that.
Yeah.
The question is, how do you sort out a mess that's quite as tangled as Enron?
It was a really difficult book to write because stories are always easiest to tell when you can tell them in chronological fashion. And this happened, and this happened, and this happened. That provides you with a narrative structure. And you couldn't do that in the case of Enron because you had things happening in different parts of the company at overlapping time periods. And if you cut back and forth from one business to the other to keep it chronological, you just have a disaster on your hands. And so we ended up coming up with a structure where the beginning part of the book is kind of personality-based and tells sort of the profiles of the major people in the early years of Enron and gives you a sense of who these people were. And then we talked through it by the various businesses that Enron had and sort of told the story of each business. And so the book is structured in kind of overlapping time periods. One chapter may go from 94 to 99, and the next one may back up to 95 to 2000. And so you've got this kind of overlapping back and forth narrative structure. And that was complicated, but it was really the only way I could come up with to do it that felt like it could do justice to the meat in each of the different sections. But I was saying to some of the journalism students earlier today, I think structuring anything from a simple story to a long story to a book is just murder. I mean, that's one of the most difficult parts of the process. When you get the structure right, the writing follows the structure, and getting the structure right and figuring out how to tell a story is just, I think it's more of an art than a science. And if anybody ever tells you that they've got it down and it's just like that, it's either a disheartening story or a heartening one. But my old editor at Fortune, who I admire very much, who's now at the New York Times and who is my co-author on my new book, wrote a story for the New York Times on tobacco, and he had to rewrite it 4 times, I think, because he just couldn't get the structure to work right. So even somebody who I consider probably the best business writer out there struggles with that issue.
Those are all our questions?
there, but that's okay. Okay.
Okay.
We have one more. We can stay for one more. Just sit yourself.
My question is about Goldman Sachs. After you have published your book, did you receive any reaction from Goldman Sachs? And for example, if you were to go back, what would be their reaction?
You know, I actually have a decent relationship with them. I've written a couple of stories about the place, and it's a controversial firm today. I have a fair amount of respect for them. I'm actually working on a piece for Vanity Fair about the firm right now, trying to sort out the fact from the fiction, because many of you know, Goldman has been painted as kind of the villain, one of the villains of this financial crisis. I wouldn't go back. I think I'm too much of a loner, and I love journalism too much to ever be part of an investment bank. It just so I've never actually even had to think about it.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Bethany McLean for coming to Iowa State.